Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
That is our main news this morning, that the US has carried out a missile strike on a Syrian airbase in response to Tuesday's suspected chemical weapons attack in Idlib province, which killed dozens of civilians, including 27 children. 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired from 2 US Navy ships in the Mediterranean. President Trump said they hit the base from where the attack was launched. Here's our Washington correspondent, David Willis.
It was a decisive response from an administration that has often seemed disorganized and at times dysfunctional. A fusillade of Tomahawk cruise missiles fired from US Navy ships in the Mediterranean aimed at the Syrian airbase from which America says that deadly chemical weapons attack was launched earlier this week. A line in the sand moment for the new commander-in-chief.
On Tuesday, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad launched a horrible chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. Using a deadly nerve agent, Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children.
These are the heartbreaking images that moved the president to action, triggering in the process a remarkable shift in foreign policy on the part of his nascent administration. A week ago, White House officials professed little interest in regime change in Syria, but the use of what they say was a deadly nerve agent by Bashar al-Assad's forces has changed everything.
Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also to end terrorism of all kinds and all types.
News of the missile strikes somewhat overshadowed a one-day summit with China's President Xi, at which the two leaders were expected to discuss the growing threat posed by North Korea. But depending on where the US goes from here, he could find he has his work cut out in Syria, a quagmire of a conflict which could define his presidency one way or the other.
Well, let's get more from David Willis, who is in Washington. And David, of course, that is the big question. Where do things go from here?
Yes, indeed. And the indications, Jonah, are that this is, if you like, a one-shot deal, that the United States will not be planning, for now at least, any further attacks of this kind. But that's the unofficial word. We wait to see. And the administration simply confining its comments about this attack to the fact that they believe it was a proportionate response and one which sends the sort of message that's needed to Bashar al-Assad, namely that he cannot get away with this sort of use of chemical weapons.
David, thank you very much. It was Tuesday when a clearly emotional President Trump spoke in the Rose Garden in the White House about the horrible, terrible chemical attack that had killed, as he put it, beautiful babies in Syria. He then said something should happen. Well, that something did happen in the early hours of this morning. 59 Tomahawk missiles were fired at the Shirat air base, from which the Americans said the chemical strike was launched. This is the first time America has intervened directly against the Syrian government in the conflict that has been going on for 6 years, and it marks a real shift in policy and attitude. This was what the president had to say just hours after the attack.
On Tuesday, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad launched a horrible chemical weapons attack on innocent civilians. Using a deadly nerve agent, Assad choked out the lives of helpless men, women, and children. It was a slow and brutal death for so many. Even beautiful babies were cruelly murdered in this very barbaric attack. No child of God should ever suffer such horror. Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched. It is in this vital national security interest of the United States to prevent and deter the spread and use of deadly chemical weapons. There can be no dispute that Syria used banned chemical weapons, violated its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention, and ignored the urging of the UN Security Council. Years of previous attempts at changing Assad's behavior have all failed, and failed very dramatically. As a result, the refugee crisis continues to deepen, and the region continues to destabilize, threatening the United States and its allies. Tonight I call on all civilized nations to join us in seeking to end the slaughter and bloodshed in Syria, and also to end terrorism of all kinds and all types. We ask for God's wisdom as we face the challenge of our very troubled world. We pray for the lives of the wounded and for the souls of those who have passed. And we hope that as long as America stands for justice, then peace and harmony will, in the end, prevail. Good night, and God bless America and the entire world. Thank you.
Well, Russian state television is showing pictures of the damage caused to the airbase. We've not got the pictures at the moment, but I can tell you what they're saying about the impact of the airstrikes, saying that 9 planes were destroyed at that Syrian airbase, but the main runway was left relatively unscathed. The pictures reportedly showing craters, debris and rubble. But the main runway looking largely intact, although those 9 planes reportedly destroyed. Reaction coming out of Germany and France. A joint statement has been issued saying after the chemical weapons massacre of the 4th of April on Khan Sheikhoun in northwestern Syria, a military installation of the Syrian regime was destroyed by a US airstrike last night. President Assad bears sole responsibility for this development. So that just through from France and Germany, a joint statement there. Well, in a moment, we will speak to Simon Jenkins, a newspaper columnist, who says anything the West does will only make matters worse. We're also joined down the line from Syria by Abdel Kafi Alhamdo. In France, we can talk to UNICEF's Geert Capelard. And in Liverpool, the Labour MP Alison McGovern, who voted against military action in 2013. First, let's go to our correspondent Ben James in Beirut in neighbouring Lebanon. Ben, what is the latest that you are hearing there?
Well, about an hour ago, we were watching Syrian state TV to see a statement by the Syrian army, their first official response to what's happened at this airbase. They're talking about 6 people having been killed. We'll await any further news on that, but that's their latest statement. There was some report going around of somebody of the rank of Commodore having been killed. That was according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, but we wait to see whether there's further confirmation of that. We also heard from the Syrian army statement a comparison to terrorism. They were calling the United States essentially a partner of ISIS and Nusra as a result of this strike. The so-called Islamic State they're referring to there, and also the group formerly known as the Al-Nusra Front, that's now part of a wider umbrella of jihadist groups called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham that many around the world still consider to be linked to Al-Qaeda, and is certainly a designated terrorist group according to the United States government. They do operate in the area of northwest Syria, in which Khan Sheikhoun is the place, the site, of course, of this alleged chemical attack earlier in the week. That's what the Syrian army, the Syrian military has been saying. The governor of Homs, the province in which this airbase is, has also been talking through the morning, talking about the rescue efforts on the base, talking about the firefighting taking place, talking about the material damage as well, as opposed to high numbers of casualties. And of course, it's still unclear exactly how much warning the Syrians may have got. We do know that the US military used their established protocol with the Russians to inform them of their operation, to tell them that this was going to take place, not to seek their consent, they made very clear, not a political conversation, but the military notification. We understand now from the Russians that the agreement through which those notifications take place is now off as far as they're concerned. It was signed in October 2015, just after the Russians began to use air operations in support of President Assad. We've also been hearing from somebody who lives very close to this airbase. One of the BBC producers has a contact close by. They were speaking to somebody who lives there, saying that they were woken up at 3:45 in the morning, very early, by the repeated sounds of these cruise missiles hitting. Earth-shaking sounds was how they were described. And then they were talking about the ambulance activity in the area, and also talking to people that they know on the airbase, talking about devastation. So it's still unclear exactly what the situation is on the base itself, precisely how many planes may have been damaged. The Americans say that they were targeting not just aircraft, but the infrastructure that might support them, so things like fuel, things like ammunition, on the base that they say they have conclusively linked to the what they say is the chemical attack on Khan Shaykhun, which of course the Syrian government denies having carried out.
I mean, in terms, there are obviously two questions. That one, whether this is going to be of limited impact on military capability, which presumably it will be, but the broader strategic implications, we really just have to wait to see what happens next.
We certainly do, and you're right, whether this is maybe more of a symbolic strike than one which might have a huge practical impact on what the Syrian Air Force and forces can do. Of course, because the Americans felt they had to militarily warn the Russians are allies of the Syrians, so presumably the Russians warned the Syrians as well. We don't know how much warning was given, we don't have any information about that. We know that that happened according to the Americans. The Russians on their part have said that none of their personnel were hurt. We also heard some reports to suggest that Russian forces were seen going away from the airbase yesterday. We can't corroborate those reports, but there is a notion that with some kind of warning, then maybe the casualties and maybe the damage as well was more limited than it otherwise would have been. Still, though, the symbolism of this strike cannot be underestimated, and the way in which it shows a potential change, a huge shift from the Americans in their policy. Only last week they were talking about it being silly to target President Assad when the priority was targeting the so-called Islamic State.
Thank you, Ben. Well, let's bring in our other guests in the studio and elsewhere. I want to come to you, first of all, Abdelkafi Al-Amdou, because you are just north of Idlib. What is your reaction to the American intervention now?
Hello, thank you very much. I want to say that everyone on earth may be happy to have partial punishment for the criminal, for the crimes that Assad made. Just when I woke up, I saw my brother-in-law, who is 7 years old. He told me, they say that US targeted Assad. Does this mean that you will not see planes in the sky? Does this mean that I'm going to go to school without planes? Okay, I said this is not the case. In general, even children are happy with this. I mean, these strikes. But frankly speaking, for me, I cannot consider them my likely strikes. I can consider them only strikes. Because when you consider it a my likely strike, it should be a kind of surprise, a kind of shocking strikes. But as America said that they talked to and told Russia before these strikes, and frankly speaking, even the damage with one of the most technical weapons on this earth, this kind of damage and casualties and losses are so limited. So this means it's political strikes. It's more than military strikes.
Alison McGovern, in 2013, you were one of the MPs here that voted against military action in Syria. Do you think it is now time for military action?
Well, the approach that's taken needs to be part of a strategy to protect civilians. You know, as we've just heard, people need to get to school, they need to be able to have access to hospitals and medical care. So if this new approach is to work, it must be part of a strategy to protect civilians in Syria. That is what I and others right across the House of Commons on both parties have been saying for some time now. And so we would ask the British Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary to come back to the House of Commons when we come back from recess and explain how the UK can play a role with France and Germany and others to make sure that whatever happens from now, it is part of a comprehensive strategy that gets Syrian kids back to school, that gets supplies to hospitals so that people can be treated and taken care of, and that we get on the road to peace in Syria.
Sorry, I mean, spell out what you think the strategy should be.
Well, the UN needs access. You see, one of the problems that we've had is that there are, warehouses full of aid that has been made available by the international community. But the Syrian regime has had a campaign not just of dropping bombs, but also of starving people and besieging Syrian towns. So as part of what is going on now, the UN must be allowed to have access to people who need help in Syria, get that medical equipment in, get food aid and other necessary supplies to people in Syria, open up humanitarian corridors, because these strikes will not be enough unless they're part of a strategy that helps save lives in Syria.
And Simon Jenkins, those are exactly the things that have been said for a long time. It hasn't been happening. Does military action now change that?
I don't think it changes anything. It's one thing to spank a child, but what do you do next? This has been going on 8 years. It's a very, very nasty civil war. It's the most nasty civil war I think we've ever come across. But it won't end by outside intervention. It just won't. The only way this war is going to end is when the one side wins. And one side appears to be winning. Unfortunately, it's Assad.
In 2013, though, he was much weaker. I mean, in the years since, with Russian support, with Iranian support, without decisive action by the international community, he has become a lot stronger.
Well, it's moot. I mean, I don't think many people thought he was really going to lose. Right. But anyway, you're quite right. The Russians decided to back him. The Iranians decided to back him. And most important, the Lebanese factions decided to back him. He was not likely then to lose. Our only option then was to help the other people prolong the civil war. That was lethal. I think we've played a part in prolonging the civil war. We're not going to bring it to an end by supporting the opposition now. It just doesn't make any sense. I can totally understand why people feel a desire to react to a horror. You want to do something. You almost cheer when you see those bombs going off. But that's not sensible. That's not rational politics. You've got to think of the consequences. We've been here twice before in the Middle East with civil wars, in Lebanon and then in Iraq. Both times we intervened, both times was a disaster. Why do it again?
Alison McGovern, do you agree that we have played a part in prolonging a civil war?
Well, I disagree with Simon in the sense of Syria is Syria. We have to treat this situation on its merits. It's too easy to say this is just like other countries. I don't agree with this counsel of despair that there's nothing that we can do. Personally, I think that what we need now is a re-establishment of the international humanitarian principles that we all sign up to. We signed up to.
Yes, but sorry to interrupt, but this is exactly what's been said for a long time. It's not happened. Do you wish you had actually voted for military action back in 2013? Might things be different now?
Joanna, I have no way of knowing if my vote had been different in 2013, whether the situation would have been better or worse. It's an impossible question to ask. Do I regret that maybe I could have brought the Prime Minister back on more occasions? Maybe we could have asked more and more questions. Of course, I think about every missed opportunity every day. But my regret will do no good for people in Syria. What can do some good is a re-establishment of humanitarian principles and putting pressure through the UN mechanisms to get aid in, and if necessary, if there are people who need to be helped, to get them out so that we can try and save lives in Syria. That is what we can do now.
Let's bring in Geert Capellere from UNICEF. it is now a chemical weapons attack that has led to this action by America. I appreciate you're talking about the humanitarian aspect rather than the politics, but what is your reaction to that? Because obviously, I mean, well, there have been previous chemical weapons attacks that have not elicited this response. But aside from that, if this had been a conventional weapons attack, there would not have been this reaction now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joanna, I have been a humanitarian worker for 25 years. I have been working in many, many conflict settings. I do not recall a single conflict that got sorted out by military power. I'm afraid the same applies to Syria. I don't think that a military solution is the way forward for what has happened for the last 6 years and continues happening in Syria.
How do you see the solution?
Well, the solution needs to come through a dialogue, a political dialogue, how strange all of that may sound today. It is a dialogue that brings all the parties around the table, the parties inside Syria and the parties who have influence over those who are active inside Syria, all around the table. And from a UNICEF's perspective, we have been calling and will continue calling to all these parties to maybe take a few seconds and start their negotiations reflecting on all what these 6 years so far has brought for children inside Syria.
Abdul Kafi, when you hear the conversation focusing on, the need for diplomacy, for all the parties to be around the table, and for military intervention not to be the answer, how do you react?
Okay, thank you. Really, that diplomatic and the political issues cannot be achieved easily in Syria without military action. I mean, as Assad says, just maybe yesterday, he said that there is no solution for him but to retreat or Syria, but to be victory. I mean, he wants Syria for his game. So the political and dialogues solutions in Syria are not available this time. Not because we don't want, no, because the other part, I mean, Assad, he doesn't want this solution. They want to get all the land. After that, they want, the political issues and dialogues and conversations. So this means that they are not ready for it. We want peace. All people here want peace. But we have been listening to this world. I mean, a political solution for Syria for 6 years. What happened? Nothing has changed. How many Geneves? How many Astana? There are many. There are maybe dozens of conferences, but nothing has changed. This means that there will not be political solution for Syria now, at least. So if there should be a political solution, it should be preceded by a military solution to punish and to stop the madness of the criminal of Assad and his allies. I want to say about that, he used the chemical weapons to say that we can do anything. This is our land and we can do anything. Of course, he knows that another Genève is coming. So nevertheless, he used chemical. By the way, I want to say that the international community hasn't had a movement, but when a chemical attack happened, I mean, when they saw the pictures of children, the pictures of people dying who are like their children in front of them. But what about the other weapons? For 6 years, we are experiencing.
Quick final thought, Simon Jenkins. This does show Assad that he cannot act with impunity.
He can act with impunity. I'm sorry. We say these phrases come out time and again, and we must punish, all these things. He can more or less do what he likes as long as Russia's behind him. Russia's behind him. We've got to recognise the realpolitik of this. It is not going to be ended other than militarily at the moment. Once that's over, I think once Assad in some sense has won, he's obviously winning, Once this is won, then I honestly think the pressure on him will be to go. But at the moment, it's clearly not going to happen. And these gestures they establish a moral signalling of some sort, but they don't do any good. You don't do good, even in civil wars, by bombing people. And I'm afraid that remains the truth. If there was another way out, we would have found it by now, but we haven't. It's a desperate situation. We're sitting in armchairs millions of miles away, but we have an obligation, I think, to think clearly what we're doing. And just going around dropping bombs all over the Middle East now, I mean, 6 or 7 countries we're bombing, it achieves nothing. It makes us feel good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you. And do stay in touch. Your thoughts always welcome. #VictoriaLive. Well, let's just bring you all the latest developments on our main news this morning. Overnight, the US fired nearly 60 Tomahawk missiles from warships in the eastern Mediterranean at the Syrian government's Shariat airbase near the city of Homs. The White House says Syrian planes from the base carried out Tuesday's raid on the rebel-held town of Khan Sheikhoun in Idlib province, in which it is alleged chemical weapons were used. Last night, the US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said the US held Syria responsible for that suspected gas attack in Idlib, and he also called on Russia to modify its relationship with Syria.
As part of the Syrian conflict, there is no doubt in our minds, and the information we have supports, that Syria, the Syrian regime under the leadership of President Bashar al-Assad, are responsible for this attack. And I think further, it is very important that the Russian government consider carefully their continued support for the Assad regime.
Sir, does Assad have to go?
Assad's role in the future is uncertain, clearly, and with the acts that he has taken, it would seem that there would be no role for him to govern the Syrian people.
So what steps is the United States prepared to take in order to remove him from power?
Well, the process by which Assad would leave is something that I think requires an international community effort, both to first defeat ISIS within Syria, to stabilize the Syrian country, to avoid further civil war, and then to work collectively with our partners around the world through a political process that would lead to Assad leaving.
Well, the airstrikes not only represent a change in the direction and escalation of America's role in Syria, but could also have an effect on its relationship with the regime's strongest backer, Russia. Russians were present at the base, which was targeted in the early hours of this morning, although their role there is unknown. They're now saying the airstrike was a violation of international law, and we are just hearing from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov that no Russians were killed in the US airstrikes, and he's also saying he hopes the provocation will not lead to irreparable damage to ties with the US. Well, as Donald Trump meets the Chinese president today, where the situation in North Korea will no doubt be on the agenda, the world will be watching closely to see how all of this unfolds. We can talk to our diplomatic correspondent, Jonathan Marcus. Decisive is the word that is repeatedly being used. Very swift reaction by Donald Trump and a swift change of policy.
Well, a very decisive and swift response, yes. I think, though, if you look at the method of the attack, the scope of the attack, I think all the signs are that this is what the Americans say it was, a limited strike intended to re-establish a deterrent line against the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime in Syria. They hit essentially infrastructure, aircraft hangars, runways, aircraft themselves. They weren't aiming at barrack blocks or so on and so forth. There may well have been casualties. That obviously is going to be regrettable. It's good news, I think, that there weren't any Russian casualties at the base. But I think the Americans have essentially done what many people will argue, certainly in America, there have been many voices saying that this is what President Obama should have done back in 2013. The great difference now, of course, is then the Assad regime was much shakier. It might have begun a process that would have led to the regime's fall. Today, the regime has consolidated itself with Iranian and Russian help. So I think this is in many ways a message as much to Russia as it is to Damascus. Mr. Trump, for all the criticism of him and the bluster and his inexperience, he does seem to have reacted pretty resolutely in this first crisis.
In terms of military impact, what might this do to the capability?
Well, we don't know yet fully the extent of the damage on the ground, obviously.
So nine airplanes reportedly.
I mean, this is a
destroyed.
base which we think operates a fairly old version of the Sukhoi jet, which the Americans believe was responsible for delivering chemical weapons earlier this week. So, you know, they will have lost some aircraft, they will have lost some personnel probably and some equipment. It doesn't fundamentally alter the military balance on the ground, but what it does do, it sends a very clear warning that if you have recourse to these sorts of weapons, this kind of consequence will occur. We have to be very blunt about this. You know, Mr. Trump made a big thing of the appalling images of children and babies affected by the chemical attack. We all know that babies and children are being killed in Syria, you know, virtually every day of the week by conventional weapons, have been for many, many years now. But, you know, there is, particularly in the West, a very strong sense that chemical weapons do cross a line. They have been taboo. They have been a particular concern ever since their first use in the Great War, in World War I. And Mr. Trump made it very clear. He thinks that there should be a general prohibition of their use. They are banned by treaty and so on and so forth. And when people use them, there have to be consequences.
Jonathan, thank you. Well, as countries across the world digest last night's news from Syria, let's try to gauge some of the international reaction. In a moment, we will speak to Crispin Blunt, the chairman of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Also, we're joined by Jonathan Paris, a Middle East analyst. And down the line, we can talk to Dr. Baiza Ünal, a research fellow at Chatham House, who is a Turkey specialist. We will also hear from our Moscow correspondent, Sarah Rainsford. But first, let's speak to our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier, who joins us from Westminster. Eleanor, what reaction from Westminster?
Well, the UK government has really led the international support of the US for this attack, this strike on the airfield in Syria. Both the Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister were informed throughout, I'm told. Sir Michael Fallon, who I was speaking to just a few moments ago, said he and the Prime Minister had been in contact at all levels. The government had been in contact with the US administration. He said that the US Defence Secretary had called him yesterday to discuss the options that the US were looking at. And then James Matteson called again to inform him of Donald Trump's decision and that the strikes were going ahead. Sir Michael said that the strikes were limited and appropriate. They were appropriate response to what he said were the barbaric chemical weapons attacks that took place earlier this week. So I asked Sir Michael Fallon if he thought the attacks were appropriate, then why wasn't the UK itself also involved in the attacks?
Well, they didn't ask us to get involved. They didn't ask us to choose a particular option. They've decided to take this action, a very limited, appropriate action, attacking the airfield, the aeroplanes and the equipment that they believe were involved in the gas attack, with the very specific purpose of trying to deter the regime from future gas attacks on their own people, including civilians.
Now, I did ask Sir Michael if the UK had been asked to get involved, would the UK have been involved? He wouldn't answer that question, but he did confirm that if the UK government was going to get involved in some sort of military action, then the government would consult Parliament. It would go back to the House of Commons and ask MPs to vote on whether we should be sending in any military action. Remember that back in 2013, MPs rejected a vote on action in Syria. We have heard from the Liberal Democrats this morning too. Tim Farron put out a statement saying that the attack by the American forces was the right thing to do, but the Lib Dems called on the government to do more, saying that rather than just putting out a bland statement welcoming the US attacks, it should now follow up and call an emergency meeting of the NATO alliance. It said that evils happen when good people do nothing. We cannot sit by while a dictator gasses his own people. We cannot stand by. We must act. So clear support from the UK government of the US's actions overnight, but no support at the moment for the UK to get involved itself militarily.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Crispin Blunt. Is it time now for there to be more action, Crispin Blunt? What do you think about this action?
No, I think the Americans have carefully calibrated this action. It's in relation to the chemical strike. They've said there's no doubt that the Russians and the Syrians were responsible for, or the Syrians were responsible for it. They have explicitly rejected the explanation given by the Russians and the Syrians that this hit a chemical dump held by the rebels. And if they are 100% confident of their intelligence, then this was an appropriate reaction limited to the airfield and the aircraft that launched this attack. And obviously they've informed the Russians in the process to make sure that their people were not caught as collateral damage in this process. And indeed the Syrians must have been aware of it, because there appear to have been very limited casualties at the airbase. The Syrians are saying they've had 6 fatalities, but a great deal of ground damage, which would mean that the strike in that sense has been pretty successful in its objectives.
If it is just left there, though, does it actually make any difference? It's not going to make a huge difference on the ground to military capability. And what actually then changes?
Well, this is related, obviously, to the illegal use of chemical weapons. And Syria was supposed to have surrendered its chemical weapons in 2013. The Russians brokered that deal, and they oversaw the disarming of the Syrian government of its chemical weapons. And if it is the case that they used them, then plainly the Russians didn't do their job properly, and the Syrians illegally held on to these weapons, and they've now taken the consequences. But of course, tragically, the consequences have been meted out on the people in Idlib province, as we've all seen.
I mean, sorry to interrupt, but does a solitary airstrike like this actually change anything?
Well,
in terms of you know, the situation on the ground with chemical weapons?
Well, it will certainly change the situation on the ground as regards chemical weapons. It is inconceivable that there would be a repeat of this if these weapons were used by the Syrians. Now, the evidence on the ground we're getting from some journalists there is there are no buildings that were struck that would support the Russian and Syrian explanation. We're also at the UN Security Council, the Russians were opposing a resolution which would have mandated an inspection of the airbase and the records of the aircraft that took part in the raid. So whilst of course it looks very odd that the Syrians would have used chemical weapons at this time, given that the regime is not under an existential threat, and indeed they appear to be securing a number of localized ceasefires around the country. That set aside, if the Americans are 100% confident that this was used by Syrians, this will send a very profound message about the future use of chemical weapons. What it does on the wider conflict, it will have to yet to see, but it may encourage the Syrian government to be rather more cooperative in the political talks that are now taking place in Geneva.
Jonathan Paris, do you agree with that analysis, that this will mean that Syria would not use chemical weapons again?
Well, having worked with Crispin in the past, I always agree with him. He's brilliant. There was one little nuance that he said he was surprised that Assad would have picked now as a time to go with chemical weapons. But that's precisely the problem with Assad. If he feels he has Russian and Hezbollah and Iran support and no opposition from the United States, which he hadn't faced under Obama, he will go to the limit. That's the way he operates. That's the way much of the Middle East operates.
And just prior to this, President Trump had reiterated his view that actually Assad was not the target, it was IS.
I would say that what Assad did, assuming he did this earlier this week, is probably the stupidest mistake any leader could do for his own cause. I mean, he has just changed the Trump administration 180 degrees. But yes, I agree with Crispin that this was a calibrated act. It's not meant to escalate into a full-blown civil war with Russia. It's not meant to escalate even on a local level. But it is a message that when this president says, I'm going to do something, you know, it's a message to others that he may very well do something.
Let's get more of the Russian reaction. We can bring in Sarah Rainsford from Moscow. What is being said in Moscow, Sarah?
Well, what you might expect, I suppose, a lot of outrage, a lot of indignation, some strong statements coming both from the Foreign Ministry and from the Kremlin. We heard first from President Putin's spokesman, who talks about Mr. Putin describing what had happened as an act of aggression against a sovereign nation, and talking about it having a very significant effect on relations between Washington and Moscow. But as he said, that relationship is already in a pitiful state. We've then heard from the Foreign Minister, Mr. Lavrov. He's been speaking in the last few moments, and he's talked about the fact that as far as Russia's concerned, there was no basis for these airstrikes by the United States. Russia saying over and again that there should have been an investigation into what happened. They dispute the idea that Syrian government troops used chemical weapons. So Mr. Lavrov was saying, without waiting for an investigation, the United States has chosen to strike in Syria, and saying that it shows that this was simply a pretext, and that the United States is aiming to remove President Assad from power. This is about regime change. It's not about the use of chemical weapons. So very strong language. The question, of course, is whether that leads to any kind of action from Russia. But I think it's important to note, as you've been just hearing, that there were no Russian casualties in this strike. And looking at images that we've seen on state television here from the airfield itself, there seems to be a number of planes still intact. The damage is obviously fairly serious, but as I say, a minimal consequence in terms of human lives lost. And we do know that the Pentagon did give information, advance warning of this strike along its information channels, which it still has with Russia, about what happens in Syria, and therefore it seems that the damage has been kept to a minimum.
Dr. Beyza Ünal, Turkish specialist, how will Turkey see this intervention?
Well, the first reaction from Turkey was positive. The president actually said that they were expecting the United States to take an action way before, and he said the actions speak louder than the words, and which is true in Turkish sense, and they are thinking that this is a positive outcome. The caution, I think, with Turkey is that they have been doing dialogues and agreement between Russia, Turkey, and Iran in Geneva talks. So it would be a cautious area. I think that Turkey needs to be careful on balancing the relations between United States and Russia. Now that we know that Russia is making statements about going away from the agreement to deconflict the airspace in Syria.
Crispin Blunt, on that, what do you think now about no-fly zones, safe zones in Syria, and those potentially being right back on the agenda?
Well, the situation is immensely complex, and what you've got to do with any proposed intervention is then play out what the consequences are, and the difficulty with no-fly zones and secure zones is then securing it. You may be able to secure it from the air, but if you've got an area on the ground which could then be infiltrated by people, who are the security forces who are going to keep the area clear on the ground? And if you look at the complexity of the situation in northern Syria, those are quite difficult questions to answer. It would seem that the Turks are trying to establish some kind of safe zone in their advance down to Al-Bab, and the Syrian Kurds, who are their enemies, who they see as allied to the PKK, who are an identified terrorist organization running an insurgency in eastern Turkey, have managed to get both Russian and American and Syrian government forces deployed between them and the Turkish forces, really covering their flank. And that just gives you some sense of the complexity that is on the ground there. What's really needed is for the international community to get back to where it was in November 2015 with the agreement at the International Syria Support Group to focus on both ISIS and the campaign against them, and on a political settlement for those who can be brought into a political agreement of the competing parties in the Syrian civil war.
On the complexity, Jonathan Paris, it's interesting actually to see a tweet from Donald Trump in 2013 when President Obama had said there was a red line if chemical weapons were used, didn't take military action, and then Donald Trump said President Obama's weakness and indecision may have saved us from doing a horrible and costly, in more ways than money, attack on Syria. It is a highly complicated pictures
Well,
has been
I think
clear throughout.
you don't have to go back to 2013. Just go back 1 week and listen to the statements that he made and that Ambassador Haley made at the UN, which is that we can live with Assad. But after he sees those choking babies, he really was impacted. So this is a president that is event-driven, if you will. He's not an ideological fixed guy. So you have to take into account what events do to him. And that's what Assad failed to do. And that's what Putin is failing to understand. Mr. Trump has scored a number of victories with this little maneuver. I agree, though, with Crispin that this is a one-off in that sense. It shouldn't be a mandate for further attacks. But I think Assad and Iran and Russia should be put on notice that they do not own Syria.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Here, the Defence Secretary, Michael Fallon, said the UK government fully supported America's decision to act. A number of other world leaders have also stated their support for Washington's missile strike, as Keith Doyle reports.
Syrian TV reported the airstrikes, the presenter announcing one of our air bases in the central region was exposed at dawn today to a missile strike by the United States, leading to losses. The state TV station then played national music and showed pictures of the Syrian army. The country's information minister told the station he believed the strike was limited in time and space and was expected, and he did not expect any military escalation. The British Defence Secretary said the UK was given advance warning and the government supported the US action.
The Americans believe they've exhausted all possible diplomatic and peaceful ways of dealing with the use by the regime of chemical weapons, and they have been determined to try to prevent future attacks like this. So they've taken this action today, limited and appropriate action against the airfield and the aeroplanes and the equipment that was used, they believe, in this attack, and that is action that we fully support.
As the US released pictures of the flight paths taken by the Syrian planes it says were involved in Tuesday's chemical attack and aerial shots of this morning's bombed airfield, Russia issued a strongly worded statement calling the US bombing aggression against a sovereign state in violation of international law, and insisting the Syrian army did not use chemical weapons. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu welcomed the US attack, saying that in both word and action, Mr. Trump sent a strong and clear message that the use and spread of chemical weapons will not be tolerated. Other world leaders gave similar support.
The Australian government strongly supports the swift and just response of the United States. This was a calibrated, proportionate and targeted response. It sends a strong message to the Assad regime.
Syrian rebel groups called on the US to continue the attacks. They and the world will wait to see if the situation escalates. Keith Doyle, BBC News.
Well, let's now show you the pictures that we have now got from the airbase, which was hit by the American airstrikes, and we can see their rubble. As we continue to look, that seems to be inside. Oh, there you go. That's the runway, which, as we've been hearing on reports, was not damaged, or at least there is no particularly significant sign of damage in the pictures that we're seeing here to the runway, but it is being reported that 9 aircraft were destroyed in these attacks. Those missiles launched overnight, 58 of them, and these pictures are being shown on Russian state television, which show the damage to the airbase. Russia has said that no Russians were killed in the attack at the airbase. The United States did give warning to Russia ahead of the attack. There were some killed, though, reports that 6 people were killed at the airbase. Well, let's go to our political correspondent, Eleanor Garnier. Joining us live from Westminster, strong international support, Eleanor, for America's actions, including from Britain.
Yes, I think Britain has been at the forefront of the support for the US strikes in Syria, and the Defence Secretary Michael Fallon said that he and the Prime Minister had been kept informed throughout. He said that he'd spoken to the US Defence Secretary yesterday, and they discussed the various options that the US were looking at, and then he also spoke to him again and was informed that Donald Trump had made the decision for the strikes to go ahead. Michael Fallon described the strikes as appropriate. He said that they were limited, and he said that they were a response to what he called the barbaric chemical attacks that had taken place earlier this week. Now, I did ask him whether the UK itself would be getting involved in any military action and why it hadn't been involved overnight too. He stressed again and again that this was action taken by the US alone, that the US had not asked for the UK to be involved. And he did also say that if the UK were to consider any military action, then it would go back to Parliament, it would go back to MPs, and there would be a vote in the House of Commons. He also noted that back in 2013, of course, there was a vote about military action in Syria, and that was, of course, rejected by MPs.
Eleanor, thank you very much. Well, let's get reaction from Russia. We can talk now to Sergei Markov, who is a former MP in President Putin's United Russia Party. Thank you very much for joining us. What is your reaction?
My reaction is that it's domestic politics of the United States, and Donald Trump wants to show that he is not such weak as Barack Obama. He is really a tough guy, and he wants to become real president, because the opposition doesn't allow to Donald Trump to be a real president. That's why he decided to use such provocation with chemical weapon, which have been organized by Jabhat al-Nusra, and everybody who is informed understands it very well.
What will the impact be in terms of American-Russia relations?
I think now Russia will react strongly by words and carefully by action, because Russia understands very well that Donald Trump bombed Syria for the domestic political purposes. It was some kind of bombing of Congress, political bombing of Congress. And that's why Russia will react carefully. Of course, Russia will call, oh, it's aggression against sovereign country, Security Council should go. But I don't think that the clashes between Russia and United States will really happen after Donald Trump will reach his domestic political goals. And we, of course, concerned about unpredictability of behavior of Washington, which we had last few years, and we're very much disappointed that United States, in cooperation with Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in Syria, and with Bandera neo-Nazis in Ukraine.
In the end, I mean, it doesn't matter what you say or think about Donald Trump's motivation being to play to a domestic audience. If it impacts on the situation on the ground in Syria, it will have its desired effect.
In Syria, from a military point of view, this airstrike means not too much, because this era failed, especially for the old airplanes, and also as we should look more carefully on the future. If United States will try to make such war in Syria, which they already conducted in Iraq, of course, it will be a new catastrophe for the Middle East, and it will could lead to the potential military conflict with Russia. But if United States only will limited by this and possibly a second air strike, it will not influence situation, and we will continue Russian policy as we already used to do.
Why is it that there are still there is still the capability by Syria to use chemical weapons when there was that agreement under which Russia was supposed to oversee the ending of the use of chemical weapons to secure and destroy them. Russia failed to do that.
Yeah, it's a great question. Everybody can understand. Look from the Assad point of view. Spencer, press spokesman of Donald Trump, talking, oh, now we already not against Bashar Assad. And 2 days after this, Bashar Assad decided to use chemical weapons with no real military reasons. You know, it's madness. To believe that Bashar Assad organized this chemical attack, it's meaning that to understand nothing what happened in politics, a pure propaganda. Of course, chemical attack have been organized by Jabhat al-Nusra for the undermining possible cooperation between Russia and United States. And Jabhat al-Nusra made it quite effectively.
Thank you very much for joining us, Sergei Markov. Well, the decision by Donald Trump to launch an attack on the Syrian government regime marks a big shift in policy. Throughout his presidential campaign, Mr. Trump strongly opposed military intervention. However, after Tuesday's suspected chemical attack, he made clear his attitude had changed. Here's a reminder of what Donald Trump was saying up to this week.
But if they ever did overthrow Assad, you might end up with as bad as Assad is, and he's a bad guy. But you may very well end up with worse than Assad. That attack on children yesterday had a big impact on me. Big impact. That was a horrible, horrible thing. And I will tell you, it's already happened, that my attitude toward Syria and Assad has changed very much. They will have a message. You will see what the message will be.
Tonight I ordered a targeted military strike on the airfield in Syria from where the chemical attack was launched.
Florida Senator Marco Rubio, who ran against Donald Trump for the Republican presidential nomination, has given his response to the strikes.
My first reaction is to obviously acknowledge and appreciate the skill, the bravery of our men and women in uniform and in our armed forces. The president took an appropriate step tonight, and this is not just symbolic. It is he took an attack against an airfield that was the airfield from which these chemical attacks were conducted against innocent civilians, and I think the president made the right move. And so obviously now it is an attack that had a strategic objective, degrading Assad's capability to continue to attack his own people with nerve agents like sarin.
Well, we can talk to Dan Bilevsky, writer for The New York Times. Thank you very much for joining us. How do you think this is going to go down in America?
Well, I think initially this could actually buttress the position of Donald Trump, who's had a quite rocky 77-day presidency so far, and this could show him to be decisive and strong. After Obama in 2013 failed to call Assad into account after he used chemical weapons against his own people, many saw Obama as being weak, and now Trump can show himself to be decisive. However, there are serious risks because the base that elected Mr. Trump come primarily from Rust Belt states, and they elected him on the economy. And the last thing they want is to become mired, for the United States to become mired in another war in the region. There are also risks vis-a-vis his relationship with Mr. Putin going forward. And also, we've seen in the past that ISIS can take advantage of power vacuums in the region that this can cause if the United States suddenly focuses on taking on Mr. Assad rather than the Islamic State.
He has been criticised for being unpredictable. Does unpredictability actually, is it an asset in this situation?
In some ways, it is an asset. As we've seen with the Chinese who feel destabilized by Mr. Trump, his lack of predictability can actually put his opponents on edge and possibly work to his advantage.
And in terms of the sort of the way that the story will be covered, I mean, you're with the New York Times. There's been animosity between the New York Times and Donald Trump, and you know the sort of war between him and the media that does seem to have gone away. I mean, how do you now assess Donald Trump as president, and whether we are starting to see a sort of new direction potentially? Unfortunately, our line there froze, but we will, of course, still have plenty of reaction to those events overnight in Syria. The American airstrike on an airbase, reportedly 9 aircraft destroyed by the airstrikes, but of course the ramifications extending much beyond what the impact is on the military capability on the ground. US officials have said a red line had been crossed by President Assad's regime when it carried out a chemical attack on dozens of men, women and children in a rebel-held town earlier this week. Let's look back at what started this deadly conflict 6 years ago.
شبابنا هيوا إلى المعالي هيصدعوا بالحق يا رجالي مسرحية مسرحية هي مسرحية مسرحية للعصابة النهضوية بعد الدم لا شرعية للعصابة النهضوية بعد الدم لا شرعية للعصابة النهضوية.
A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
take military action, why does it fall on us yet again?
To me, the biggest danger of escalation is if the world community, not just Britain, but America and others, stand back and do nothing. Because I think Assad will draw very clear conclusions from that.
The ayes to the right, 272. The noes to the left, 285.
No one can imagine what happened inside Aleppo because it's a madness.
We hope that, really, we hope to have a ceasefire soon because those people now who are dying here,
they cannot go and they cannot leave whether to buy something or whether to go to the west of Aleppo.
really, it's catastrophic. The situation here, it's real catastrophic.
We condemn the use of chemical weapons in all circumstances. If proven, this will be further evidence of the barbarism of the Syrian regime.
Well, that is a look back over the history of the conflict. With me now, Justin Bronk, a military, air power and technology expert at the Royal United Services Institute, an independent think tank. Also in the studio with us, Ahmed, who was part of the student uprising against the Syrian government that began the conflict. He fled the fighting and made the perilous journey to the UK. Thank you both for coming in. Ahmed, what is your reaction? The Americans previously said a red line was crossed when chemical weapons were used. There was no military action. Now there has been.
I mean, from a Syrian perspective, it's a bit cynical because already we have over 500,000 people killed. But when you see the US government intervening in that country because of the use of the chemical weapons, the Syrian people feel like they've been let down, you know. I mean, it sends out the message that you can carry out killing people using conventional weapons. But if you use the chemical weapons, then there's a red line.
Does it make a difference going forward?
I think initially it does make some difference. I mean, we already, like, the damage has been caused. You know, the number of people have been killed, the numbers of the displaced people is appalling. But I think it sends out a message that enough is enough, and that the Assad regime should consider carefully what steps it's going to take to go ahead.
What impact do you think the lack of intervention before has had? Because obviously, as we mentioned, President Obama said that if chemical weapons were to be used, it would be a red line. They were used, and nothing happened. I mean, in terms of the support, the reaction within Syria to the way the international community was responding, and sort of where it might sort of get support from, and also the message that it sends to President Assad.
I think it's really now the reaction is a bit mixed in Syria, for example, because I've been trying to follow my friends back in Syria, watching Syrian channel news. You know, I think it's kind of mixed reaction. Some people are kind of very happy. I mean, Syrians, you know, very happy because now the US eventually intervened to destroy the Syrian air power, which the Syrian people have suffered a lot because of it. On the other side, you've got a lot of people who are really pro-Assad and so that this is not going to change anything because this has been going for a quite long time, and they're just sending a message that you need to be careful. But I think the carnage will still carry on.
Justin Bronk, reaction coming out from the Kremlin, amongst other things. The Russian Defense Ministry is saying the US airstrikes were a crude violation of the joint agreement on Syrian air safety. What was that agreement?
So the Russians and the US-led coalition have established a series of kind of working protocols to deconflict airspace sorties on both sides. So the Russians predominantly supporting Syrian army operations, and the American-led coalition predominantly going after Daesh. There is some crossover. It's quite crowded airspace. I think fundamentally what the Russians are really annoyed about is not so much that these strikes were a sort of a violation of safety protocols, because it's been made clear that the Russians were warned, and indeed warning the Russians has almost certainly decreased the efficacy of those strikes against the Syrian Air Force, because those warnings will have been passed on, the Syrian Air Force also having time to withdraw some aircraft from Sharat Air Base. I think what the Russians are really annoyed about is that there was a sort of tacit understanding that if the US-led strikes only targeted Daesh and stayed very, very carefully away from any Syrian regime forces, that then the air defense assets of the Syrian regime and the Russian forces in Syria would not be used. And that's kind of all been thrown up in the air now because that tacit understanding's been broken.
How do you pick your way through it? Because obviously there is going to be strong rhetoric on all sides. It's the actions in the end that matter.
Well, I think it's worth judging Russian intentions by what they have supported and what they've perpetrated. That is, large-scale blitzing of Aleppo and various other besieged cities alongside the Syrian Air Force, particularly targeting hospitals. So, I don't think the Russians have any particular humanitarian objections here. I think they don't particularly care if civilians are killed in large numbers in Syria. For them, it's about geopolitical influence, preserving their bases and keeping their ally Bashar al-Assad in power, because that gets them a lot of points geopolitically in the non-Western aligned world. Defender of regimes, who the West is going after for human rights abuses. So I think they're very annoyed about that. There will be sort of retaliation, probably in other theatres. So you might see pressure increased, for example, in eastern Ukraine, just to show NATO and the US in particular that there will be consequences. Mm-hmm. What will be really interesting is if these strikes are then extended towards further regime targets, what happens then to the status of Russian air defense and Syrian air defenses with regard to coalition air power. It's unlikely that even Russian air defenses would actually fire on American aircraft, but threats to do so certainly there could be made, and therefore there's this sort of game of bluff on either side, and the potential for escalation both in Syria between Russian forces and US forces, but also externally is very real there.
And just briefly from you, Ahmed, how do you feel now about Syria's future? Do you feel any more optimistic today?
I think I always want to be, optimistic, but after the damage, according to the recent figures from the United Nations, in Syria today, we have over 500,000 people killed, over 1 million people they are injured, wounded in this conflict, and over 5 million people are taking refuge in the neighboring countries, and over 7 million people are internally displaced. What happened in that country over the last 6 years is just beyond imagination, and I think it will take a very, very long time for the Syrians to go back to the stage which is starting in 2011.
Thank you both very much.
I've been getting away with it all.